Woodrow Wilson was the 28th President of the United States, born in Virginia, Stanton, Virginia. Lived then during the Civil War in Georgia, in Augusta, Georgia, and then moved with his family here in 1870. He was a novelty. He had been a college professor. Nobody thought he was going to be much of a governor. He sprang from nowhere politically, and then within a couple of years became governor and hit New Jersey just at the same kind of time. There was a national mood for reform, and Wilson pushed through a number of reforms in New Jersey. People didn't expect him to be able to do that. So it was very effective, and it gave him national prominence that he wouldn't have had otherwise. In the late 1800s, presidents had become essentially agents of the Congress. Congress drafted legislation, wrote it, and the president simply was it to carry out the legislation. Most presidents in the late 1800s saw their role as just simply executors of the will of Congress, didn't take leadership role themselves. The 20th century came along. The presidents in the early 20th century, Theodore Roosevelt most notably, and then Woodrow Wilson, were thinking in terms of challenges that they thought were much more urgent than that. They didn't think that the president could sit back simply be nothing more than an executor of the Congress's will. So they began to push to have a much more forceful presidency. And that's really what happened in the early 20th century. We begin to see the presidency as we know it. That is, where people look to the government, they think of the president as being the leader of government, the person who proposes policy, the person who leads and stimulates and pushes Congress to do things. So it's a real reversal of roles from that. So Woodrow Wilson was especially effective. Theodore Roosevelt, of course, was very effective in doing this kind of thing, but Wilson really gave content to it. And Wilson pushed through an extraordinary list of things. And what they were doing, what both Roosevelt and Wilson were doing, were responding to industrialization in the United States and urbanization. The country was getting bigger and more industrial, and people were unhappy with the domination of the country by big business. So what they were doing, what Roosevelt was proposing, and what Wilson was very effective in doing, was pushing through a program to bring business under control. This is what was known as the progressive period, and the progressive legislation beginning to exert the role of the federal government in controlling and directing the economy in various directions. And then both of them also, of course, saw the need for a major new role for the United States in the world. And Roosevelt pushed very hard for that. And Woodrow Wilson, of course, had a very important role in defining America's place in the world and its responsibility for maintaining peace around the world. And that's, of course, the thing that we all think of when we think about the League of Nations in World War I. So this is a real transformation of the presidency that took place in the early 20th century, in which Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson were really partners in a way. Although they were rivals, they also were partners in working in a similar kind of direction. In terms of domestic issues, probably the most important single thing that Wilson did was to create the Federal Reserve System, which was to create a banking system that would allow money to be moved around the country and the finances to be controlled by the government in ways that they had not been before. And that was a way of modernizing the economy so that when a crisis took place in San Francisco, for example, it didn't necessarily bring down the rest of the country. Resources could be mobilized and brought to where they were needed across the country. Money could be moved from one side of the country to the other, or even around the world. All of this was a system which had not existed before. There had been a series of independent banks. The Federal Reserve System began uniting them and bringing them together so they could work together. So that was a major breakthrough. And Wilson also adopted or pushed through Congress a new antitrust system, that is a way of regulating and controlling the size of business and making sure that competition continued. Very important. He pushed through the first federal child labor law, and a number of other things which were extremely important in modernizing the economy and the government. The failure that everybody knows about and everybody thinks about is the failure to succeed in getting the Senate to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and to have the United States join the League of Nations. That was certainly a notable failure. Whether that was as catastrophic as Wilson thought or not is another question. The problem with the whole League of Nations idea was that in order for it to work, it meant that countries had to work together, cooperate, had to give up some of their own sovereignty, and nobody was really very eager to do that, including Wilson. So how you make a cooperative international organization work when nobody's willing to surrender any of their sovereignty is a real problem. The government has, of course, changed dramatically. It was new for the president to take the lead in the country as the way that Wilson did. It was unusual, I think, for presidents to be the forefront of the administration, and I think it was also we're now much more used to it, and I would say now that what has happened is that Congress has really reasserted its role in a way that it had not for a number of years. I think the thing that bothered the leaders of the opposition in Congress, particularly about Wilson, was that they saw him as arrogant and dictating to them. They thought that he was overbearing and inflexible. And since some of them were also overbearing and inflexible, it made for a spectacular collision. He did have, I think, a series of periods of depression upon occasion. It didn't seem to me to have affected his work, but what, of course, did affect his work was his physical health. And particularly that was true in the end of his presidency, in the fight over the League of Nations, just as the thing was coming to the Treaty of Versailles was coming to a vote in the Senate. He had a massive stroke that paralyzed him and left him really without the ability to lead in the way that he had before. He'd been extremely effective as president in negotiating with Congress and getting what he wanted from them, getting the gist of it, but without having to have exactly things the way he wanted them. He lost that ability, that flexibility to compromise and negotiate. And as a result, when the battle came down to it in the end, in the fall of 1919, he got beaten because he simply couldn't do anything about it. And that was, in large part, I think, his health. I don't think it's entirely that. There were issues of some importance between the Senate and the president, but certainly his health did play a major role in his failure to get the treaty passed. I think people tend to think of Wilson as this sort of moralist who thought of a policy in strictly moralistic terms and was very rigid and very inflexible. And I think the thing that people don't know is how effective Wilson was in terms of as a politician. He was an amazingly effective politician, and that is really the secret of his success, and it's difficult to define exactly how he did that. But he was very skilled in working with other people, though he didn't seem to like other people very much. I think people ought to understand that Wilson is probably one of the most important presidents of the 20th century, that he really helped to transform the presidency, make it the center of the government. It certainly is, I think people should understand that he had a major role in the world, even though he did not succeed in getting the League of Nations adopted. Nevertheless, the principles that lie behind the League of Nations are ones which the United States has pursued ever since. It's really shaped the way modern American foreign policy has operated ever since.